Hi everyone, John here from All Miniatures Great and Small, and today I thought I'd try something a little different. I'm going to give you guys a painting tutorial. So I'm going to be painting a Soviet SU-100 for Flames of War. So this is a 1/100 scale tank. So a lot of people have been asking me how I've painted my models online in our battle reports and what's on the table and whatnot. So I thought I'd actually take the time to make a video to show you. So I slapped this guy together so we could use him as an example. To give you an idea of what I'm going for is this. This is a completed SU-100, so you can kind of see what we're shooting for. Okay, so the first thing, once that the model is assembled, the first thing we're going to do is prime this guy. Now, there's a lot of different ways we can prime a model. You can use a brush, you can use an airbrush, or in the case of what I'm doing is I'm using spray paint. I'm using Chaos Black, but there's all different kinds of primer you could use. Everyone has their favorites. This stuff's really good, but it's also pricey. I'm using it just because I had it in my stash and wanted to use it while I still had it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and prime this guy, and then we're going to come back and talk about how we're going to take our approach to painting him. All right, at least it was nice enough outside. Wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, so I was able to apply the base coat to this. You can see the Citadel Chaos Black is not quite a complete flat black. It's got something of a shine to it, like a semi-gloss almost. And it just makes the paint stick better. It's one of the reasons why it's so good. So there you go. So now I'm ready to start working, and you can kind of see I skimped on the bottom, or I missed at least part of it, but not a big deal. I am not one of those painters that meticulously paints the bottom of my tanks because no one sees them. So that's my thought process there. All right, so what I'm going to do is, just to let you know what you're getting into here, I'm not a Golden Demon level painter by any stretch of the imagination. I paint to a tabletop standard that I'm happy with, and really that's all you can ask for. So I try to do a good job, but I also realize that I might potentially have a whole bunch of these that I need to paint, so I have to be efficient with how I paint them. I can't, I can't spend too much time on each one just because there's not enough hours in the day, and that happens. Oh, I really missed that part. But something like that is okay. Our base coat that we're going to apply is going to cover all that up. All right, so let's talk about that. Basically, we're going to apply a base coat, some minor highlights, edge highlighting, and then weathering. The weathering step, which is kind of cool, is used to cover up any kind of mistakes or sins that we might have had in our paint job. I guess we'll also do we'll do the decals before we do the weathering. All right, so there you go. We've got our basic tank. The first color we're going to use is what I've been using for a base coat for all of my models is this Vellejo model color Luftwaffe Camo Green, number 086. Now, I didn't find any guide that said use this one. I have a bazillion greens in my box, and I got out a piece of spare plastic and applied different greens until I found a kind of combination I liked. So I'm going to be using this as my base coat. I'll have a list of all the paints that I've used down in the comments below, so you guys can check that out. But this is the important one. This is going to be our base coat. So let's go ahead and start applying that. Now we're going to start by again getting some paint on the palette. Now, if I was normally doing a bunch of these at the same time, I might use a wet palette. But since I'm just doing one tank, I think this is going to be fine right here. What I do want to add though is that paint is rather thick, so I am going to be adding some Lamian medium to that paint so that it's not quite so thick. The base coat, I want it to be a pretty opaque application of paint. Even then, usually I require 2 coats for the base coat. If you ever followed Duncan Rhodes, an awesome painter, used to work for Citadel, Games Workshop, he'd always talk about 2 coats. All right, so I'm just using a flat fan brush and just kind of applying it. The idea is obviously you don't want it too thick because it's going to leave all kinds of streaks and stuff on your paint job. You want a pretty smooth paint job. We want the streaks to come from the weathering and the grime. And another thing we're going to do is, we're painting a World War II tank, which is going to be filthy. I mean, these things were never clean. They got dirty the second they rolled out of the factory. So no particular step needs to be perfect, right? And that's just one of the nice things about dealing with tanks like that is you can enjoy your imperfections. Normally when you're doing, normally I do a platoon at a time, so I'm doing like 4 at a time. So it gives you enough time to do 1 coat and then go through and then apply 2nd coat right away. The other thing typically I'll do is rather than go in and try to paint each one of these road wheels, is I just try to run it on the outside and pick them up a little bit. So I'm using that black primer as basically the recess or shade color. I'm not too worried about getting paint on the tracks because painting the tracks is a separate step. I should mention here I probably should be using a painting handle, which I think once I get these tracks done we're going to go ahead and switch to the painting handle. So there you go, we're going to let that dry and then we're going to apply a 2nd coat. Okay, my first base coat is done. I just kind of covered my paints here to keep it from drying out. Disadvantage of not using my wet palette, but I see it's still pretty good. And we're just going to give that one more coat. See if we can lighten that up on camera a little bit. With my Soviets, I wanted to go with not a cartoony look, but a bright look, a bright green, which isn't very realistic, but I think it looks good. I like the pop of color. And obviously as this dries, this is not such an extreme looking color. So there we go, that's our 2nd coat. Which you can see, it gives us a nice, well, it's kind of shiny, so this is lighter than what it's going to look like when it dries, but it gives us a nice base. So we're going to go ahead and let that dry. Then we'll be back and we'll talk about highlighting. Okay, the 2nd coat is now pretty much dry, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go to the highlighting step. Now this step you could skip and be just fine. We're going to be doing so much more to this tank that we don't necessarily have to have a highlight layer for the green, but if you want to just take it up the extra notch, and I don't think it adds that much time, that's definitely something you can do. In my Soviet army I think I've done it both ways, but we'll see what it looks like. So alright, so what we're doing, and here again, here's the completed tank, so you can kind of see what we're shooting for. what we're going to do is we're going to use this as our highlight color. This is model color Vellejo German Cam Bright Green 70833. So we're not going to use this directly though. We're going to take it up and kind of mix it with our palette a little bit. So I still have some of my base coat green, and we'll just add a little bit of this stuff. It's already watered down a little bit. And basically we're going to mix it. I'm using a medium Citadel layer brush because it works just fine for what I want to do. And basically I'm just going to mix it up till I get a light enough shade that I like. I think the raw base version of this color is a little bit too bright, except for maybe the extreme highlights. But basically, and I want it to be somewhat watery, because I want it to be, I don't want it to be completely opaque. I want it to be somewhat see-through. And basically, just the principle of how lighting works, I want to put this on everywhere where the sun would make the tank brighter. Now our next step is going to be black lining this. So we're going to go in and you know, put a black line there, for example. Sorry, let's try to lighten that up again. You know, along any place where a shadow might be cast. So here we're not too worried about being too tidy, because our black lining will cover up some of those sins. And I know when it goes on, it looks pretty bright. But as it dries, it takes away some of that intensity, which is what you're looking for. And then, like, for example, I still have the base color on my palette, so if I happen to mess up and I don't like what I'm seeing, I can go back and cover it up with the base color. Like this might be a little bit too bright here, so we'll get some of that off. Go in with a little bit darker color and kind of just tap that down a little bit. Looks pretty good. But you'll see as it dries, it'll look really bright there, but as it dries, that just goes away. The other thing we want to do is along these fenders. And again, you notice I'm not being super careful with this stuff. I'm just kind of putting it in places where I think light might hit. Since I'm not doing a super thick coat, again, it dries and lets me build up layers, so that if I want to make an area particularly bright or stand out, I might let this dry and do it 2 or 3 times. Whereas if it's just something that's somewhat in the sunlight, I'm going to let it go maybe just once. And what this does is it builds a little bit of contrast into your model, because, you know, the tank comes out of the factory, it's all one color, it's all this green, but different parts of it fade differently. You're going to see, sorry, there's a little bit too much there, so wipe off the brush and spread it out. Yeah, so we're going for something like that. You could also fade, like on the sides here. If we can show that off better. But I can fade the model with a little bit brighter here on the top. And while it's still wet, a little bit darker along the middle. And do a fake kind of wet blend, basically. Yeah, so basically you go in and you pick the parts of the model that you think are going to look the best highlighted. So I'm already kind of liking what this guy's looking like. One of the areas on here that you want to highlight that stick out are these fuel barrels. And I apologize, I think my postman's outside. I hear his truck, so. And again, I'm not being perfect because I'm going to be black lining this area shortly, and that black lining will cover mistakes or make it look like streaks or what have you. Doing the same thing over here. Now, since I've got pretty much a basic highlight color on everything I want to be somewhat highlighted, maybe this hatch here. Ooh, that's a little bit too bright. Let's get some dark here. Kind of spread this guy out. And really the nice thing about the highlighting phase is it's very open to interpretation. You just kind of go with the flow. Get in touch with your joy of painting. All right, and then, like I said, maybe we highlight up the barrel a little bit more. Well, that's kind of a dramatic looking highlight there, but again, we can tap it down with a wet brush. But again, it's going to dry, and it'll look different than that. It won't be quite so in your face, right? So basically, like I've got my palette with my greens, and I'm just kind of going with what I think looks cool. Again, I'll go about halfway down. Try that brush, kind of just blend it all in. And again, I'm not looking for perfection here. You can see that's a little bit too bright. Take it down a little bit. But we do want to have some brightness. And all that's doing is, again, it's giving the tank some contrast because it's just green. And green can get pretty boring pretty quick. So, there you go. That's my highlight. I don't think I'm going to highlight any further with this combination. So the next step is going to be black lining. And for black lining, what we're going to do is we're going to use some of my favorite stuff, which is this Citadel Nuln Oil. So if you haven't ever used it, I think it's great. Now there's a couple of rules of thumb here. You could just slather this all over the model and then build your highlights back up. But I find line shading to be a better technique. At least I can control the application a little bit better. So what we're going to do is, again, we're going to slap that on. We're not going to be super careful with it because, again, we want a little bit of messiness in our model. And again, when we go in and we do things like the weathering, we can cover up anything that we don't like or aren't happy with. So let's get that back into focus there for you. And okay, we'll take it. So let's get ready to use that Nuln Oil. All right, for this step, I've got my Nuln Oil in this handy paint holder here. I'm going to be using it straight out of the pot. I know some of you, I'm sure, are freaking out there. And basically, all I'm doing is I'm looking for every place where there's a line or a grate. And when I switch brushes, I'm now using a small layer brush. And I'm basically just putting it into the lines. You know, there's a hatch back here, so we're going to want to run our... There's grates back here, so we're going to want to fill those grates in. Now these grates also take the, they're going to take a lot of weathering, so again, we don't have to be perfect with what we're doing. And as I mentioned before, one of the tactic is just to slather your model with Nuln Oil, just cover the whole thing with it, and then go back in with your base colors and basically rebuild your base coat. But I think that's a lot of work. Yeah, this line shading is at times can be tedious, but it I think overall it still saves you time. And it also depends on the model. Some techniques I might still do that, but here, this way I'm preserving the way that I highlighted my green for the most part. And you see the difference that makes when I hit the hatch. It immediately makes that stand out versus like this area right here. You could use a thinner brush. But sometimes more brush is better. So again, we're trying to get all that stuff to stand out. Because keep in mind, these guys are sitting on a table, and you're looking down at them. They call it the 3-foot test. You know, does it look good from 3 feet? And to make a tank look good at 3 feet, sometimes it's not going to look its best when you hold it a couple of inches away from your eyeballs. And that's the trade-off. For example, if you're doing infantry camouflage, you might be the most amazing painter and reproduce German chickpea camouflage exactly on your 15mm model. But you put that guy down on the table, and from 3 feet away, he just disappears into the terrain because your awesome camouflage is doing what it's supposed to do. Which is cool, but for wargaming, you might want that model to stand out at normal viewing distance, which is about 3 feet. And in that case, a simplified camouflage job that's easier to paint is more effective from that distance. And that's just something you kind of have to discover for yourself. You can see I'm trying to get in the grooves, but again, I'm not too worried about it being perfect. This can be shade. This could be something like oil and dirt and grime that's gotten in there. It's what you want it to be. It's a happy little tank. These gas tanks, as I mentioned before, we were kind of rough on the highlight. Now we are going to add some shade to these straps, or brackets, or whatever they are. Imagine these can be as messed up and dirty as you'd like because they are beat up gas tanks. You're gonna Just tear them apart. All right, so. I think our tank is looking good so far. Oh, we got a little spot in there we might want to add. Let it settle down there. So there you go. You can spend as much or as little time as you want with your lining. Obviously, the more you put into it, it'll show off, but there's a point of diminishing return. So again, I'm trying to get this tank out quickly if I'm doing a bunch of them, but I think that looks pretty good so far. So there we go. We're done with our shading. Okay, next up we're going to do some edge highlighting. I like to use Buff, Vellejo. This is a good color, not just for general highlighting, but also good for mixing. You know, if I wanted to make my green shades lighter, I would mix in some Buff instead of white, and it usually works really well. So that's what we'll do on this tank right now. All right, let's get some of this on the palette. And I just have an old beat up Citadel dry brush. Now really, when you dry brush, I'm sure everyone's kind of familiar with the technique, but basically you wipe off almost everything on there, and then you come here. I like to try it on a part of the tank that you won't see at first, so maybe back here. Let's make sure it looks good. And basically, I'm not rubbing the whole tank with this. I'm just hitting the edges. And I don't have a lot of paint, and that means I'm not going to ruin my paint job. Now you could go in, and another way to do this line highlighting, particularly if you're worried about getting it on the paint job, you could do it as by brush. So you could take your brush and very carefully edge highlight. So I could edge highlight this way as well. And sometimes that's a better technique, and sometimes it's not. So it's really just kind of figuring out. This way, with the brush, you get much more crisp effect. But sometimes you just can't get into the areas you want to get to. So again, both techniques work well. If you are slapping these together, using the dry brush is probably the faster way to do it. But again, you don't want to go nuts. And see, if I mess up with too much, oftentimes just using your hand, using your finger to wipe it off is fine. You can also very carefully just run it over the top, and then you can kind of see it's grabbing the highlights for those handles and stuff like that. Here you can be a little bit more heavy-handed because a lot of weathering is going to go on this back deck. And if you really press down, you can actually get some of those rivets. You see those rivets? how it gets the straps there. But I'm not rubbing the whole tank with this. So there we go. I think that's good. We've got a couple of areas, and see something like this where it's a little sloppy is okay, because that looks like a faded part, and if I don't like it, that'll be a good candidate for slapping some weathering on it as well. So that is a very quick step, and really I'm just looking for how these edges are emphasized. The shape of the tank is emphasized. Oh, looks like we could use some right there. Again, just the edges. Just the edges. Alright, so I think I like what I'm seeing there. So the next step is basically a glaze. So again, this is, well, it's all personal preference, I guess, but this is perfectly acceptable to take it from here and start decaling. But let's say you wanted a different shade. So for example, I'm going to pull over this guy, and you can see that the shade is different. And the reason why is, and it's just subtly different. When I got to this point, I thought the tank was a little bit too olivey green from those Luftwaffe camo colors. So what I'm going to do next is hit it with a glaze of this Waywatcher Green. It's a Citadel color. So my nice thing with dry brushing is my dry brushing's already dry, because you really don't have to do anything. The trick with working with glazes is you don't want the glaze to pool anywhere. We're not, this isn't a shade. We're not shading areas of the tank. We're just giving it one coat everywhere. And basically that's just going to modify the color just enough so that I'm happy with it. And really, you are your own worst critic. So again, I'm not going thick at all. I'm just putting it on there. A little bit more. This stuff's great for, all of the glazes are great, just if you want to add some vibrancy to the model. It's almost a little bit too much, so I'm going to rub some off and pull some of this off the model. And it gives it a vibrancy it otherwise wouldn't have, particularly since that dry brush that I put on there might have muted some of the green, particularly if I over dry brushed. So this is going to bring that green back to prominence. So we're going to go ahead and let that dry, then we'll be back with the next step. With the Waywatcher Green glaze done, the model is dry, and you can kind of see what we've got going. Now with that shade, you can see that we're much closer now to our model. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put some of Citadel hard coat. Any kind of gloss will work. Typically I just put this on the areas where I will be applying decals. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I just use an old beat up brush for this process. And not too thick, but we're going to put some here. I'll put some on this side. And that's really on this model where our decals are. Then with that, the kit comes with a decal sheet, so we'll be using some nice Soviet red stars and some slogans to make our tank look cool. Alright, so we're going to let the Citadel hard coat dry, and then we'll go ahead and start with the decals. With our gloss coat dry, we are ready to apply the decals. So I've got the decal sheet here. I've already cut out the decals I wanted to use for this tank, and I have a little tin of water here. We're going to go ahead and start with the Russian stars. It pays when you're working with decals to have a set of tweezers. So these are fine tweezers, and I use this microsol, which is decal softener basically, which helps the decal kind of melt to the surface and helps with the painted on look. One of the things that bugs me, and sometimes you just can't avoid it, is the decal looking like a decal. You know, you can see the edges, it just stands out from the rest of the model. And by using microsol and by using this gloss that we put on, we can do a lot to avoid that. So the idea is we're going to go ahead and put the decals on to the gloss coat. The gloss just makes the surface slick, so it's harder for air to get trapped behind it. Then we put some microsol on to help it melt and adhere to what we're doing, and then we're going to put another coat of gloss on top of it. So I know from working with these Battlefront decals that it does take a little while for them to soften all the way, so we can slide them off the paper. So we'll come back when those decals are ready. Alright, looks like our decals are ready. So we're going to go ahead and set that down so you can get a view. Normally it's a two-handed process here. I use the X-Acto knife to basically slide the transfer onto the hull. Then paper towel or Q-tip would let you soak up the excess, and then back to the knife to kind of position it exactly where you want. Now there's going to be some tweaking, but you get the idea. So here, sorry. We have that. And then again, we can use the X-Acto knife to position it where we want. So you can kind of see the circle that is the decal itself. That's what we want to avoid. That's what we want to get rid of. So we'll go ahead and add the other decals, the slogans, onto the side of the tank, and then we'll be ready for the next step. And we're ready for the slogan. And we'll go ahead and position that. I like the significant contrast of the white versus the green and the red. I don't particularly like the look when it's just flat green. I just think it's a little boring, but you know, everyone's taste may differ. So we'll go ahead and add this one. And you see how this one is going to be going over kind of this contour from the hatch, which is okay. We figure the guys just painted however they wanted to. The big thing is just getting this stuff so it's even. Now it's time to add some of this while it's drying. This stuff is great, even if you're going over things like hatches or grills or anything like that. This stuff will just let it melt and conform to that surface. So some might say you might not need it on a flat surface like this, but I think it always helps. Particularly this one. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and let the decals dry, and then we're going to put another gloss coat on top. And by sandwiching these decals between two gloss coat layers, in theory it should remove those outlines from the decal paper. Or not necessarily remove them, but hide them. Decals are dried, so we're going to go back to some hard coat. And we're going to slap this right on the decal area itself. Got a little bit too much there, but that's okay. And then we're going to let that dry. Next, we're just going to hit some details. We're going to get some of this. I like this. This is Army Painter, I think, gunmetal. I like it better than GW's bolt gunmetal. It's my favorite metallic paint. I like it a lot. But we need this. I use this for things like gun barrel, or machine gun barrels, I should say, stuff like that. Really, the only thing I'm going to get here is going to be these tools. And really, that's about it. Then next, we're going to finally address the tracks. Now, the thing with the tracks, at least my method with the tracks, is that I don't need a lot of work on the tracks, because the tracks are going to be covered with mud and dirt and whatnot in the next step. So really, all we're doing is we're going for just the basics. For that, I'm going to be using one of my favorite colors, which is Vellejo German Gray. If you guys don't use German Gray, you should be using German Gray. I use it instead of black. I very rarely use black paint anymore. I almost always use German Gray. And then if I want to make it darker, I can highlight the German Gray with Nuln Oil or something like that. All right. So, like I said, we want to make a very basic track here with the gray. And again, I don't paint the bottoms of my tank, so I'm going to just go as far as you would be able to see on the tabletop. Okay, and we'll hit the back side. German gray is a nice dark gray that works for so many things. A nice effect you could do too with German gray is mix it with some of the metallics, and it gives a nice dark gun barrel look to it. Now, you can see I'm just kind of getting the outside of these tracks. But there's still some green down there on the tracks. So for that we need kind of a different brush. And basically just get into those gaps. There's a lot more you could do with the tracks if you wanted to, but to be honest, the way I paint these tracks, I don't think it's necessary. Basically, we're just cleaning it up a little bit so that we're hiding the green. There we go. Getting all that stuff on my hands. Alright, so that gets us to a good spot as far as the tank itself. So next step is, I think it's the funnest step, which is the weathering. Alright, for my weathering anyway, I'm using these Mig Weathering Powders. So I've got track brown I'm going to be using, some rust, some European dust, and some black smoke. So I typically use those four. The one I start with is usually the European dust, because that's the one that typically gets on most places. So this stuff is basically, it's like a pastel powder. So, you know, it's just a powder. Probably your wife's makeup uses something similar. I like using isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, to spread it out onto the tank. You could do it with no with no liquid at all. And I also like to use foil as kind of a palette. So I'm just going to drip some alcohol on here. And I'm going to pour myself out a dollop of this stuff. So you can kind of see what we got here. Basically, it's just a pile of dirt. So really, you're putting real dirt on the tank. So I kind of mix it up in the alcohol. And the idea is the alcohol evaporates pretty quick, and it sticks the goop where you want it. So let's go ahead and hit the bottom before we before I attach it back to the base, so we can do the rest. Basically, I'm just slapping it on there. All right, I had to do some adjustment there on the stand, but so basically you're taking it, and by using the alcohol, I can thin it or make it thicker. The nice thing is too, I can use alcohol to get rid of it as well. So I like to go on the edges. Now normally this stuff looks much more intense when it's wet than when it dries, and then also once it dries, it and you apply like a flat coat over it, it takes down that intensity even more. So you might have something that when I'm done here looks very kind of dirty and filthy, but when you put the flat coat on, it dials that intensity back. I'm going to just put a little dust along the sides. I'm just kind of dabbing it where I want. I imagine the guys getting into that cabin and opening that up, they're going to get that dirty. Same thing back here. Put some of this dust in the tracks. I'm also going to use track brown. Excuse me. I'm also going to use track brown down here. See, that is too much. So I can just use the raw alcohol to kind of take some of it out and spread it different places. Because really this dries just like real dirt. Make sure I've got my dirt in all the crevices and corners where I like it. Okay. So that's looking good. That might look a little bit too thick there, so we can always get rid of some of it. But again, that's up to you. You want a super dirty tank, you can make yourself a super dirty tank. That's kind of the fun of it. So really you're going through here and you're just kind of hitting all those spots that kind of look good to you. Alright, so let's hit the, let's do some rust. Get a little scoop of that on the palette. Don't need a lot of this. Really don't need a lot of it at all. Okay. Basically I'm going to use a kind of a cruddy old brush, barely any hairs at all, for this. And this basically we're just finding a few spots where we can maybe drag or create rust that's different from, slightly different tone than the brown that we're using. One thing that it can always sell the decals too is having dirt or grime go over the decal. The decal's part of the tank, it's not slapped on afterwards. So again, we're not going crazy with the rust. You could go crazy with the rust, but we're not going to. Alright, there we go. Now, next thing is, let's go ahead and slap some track brown. This stuff's really dark. And this is great for covering up a multitude of laziness on the tracks. So you can kind of see the track there, the gray track. Now it's mostly brown. You can thin that down quite a bit, although this brown is such a dark pigment, it really gets into everywhere, and that's okay. The nice thing is we can, once it's dry, we can rub off areas we think are maybe a little bit too much. Add a little bit more. I'll put some on the bottom of the tank here. There we go. Might also want to put some here, kind of coming off these exhausts. Alright, so my tank's looking suitably grungy and grimy. One thing I think I want to do though is some of these areas here, I want to kind of go around them with some more dirt to bring that out. And granted, we blacklined those spots, but the black lining just represents shadows. Now we're just adding some legit dirt. Okay. I'm happy with that. So the last thing is the black. The black, we are going to dry our brush. So basically, and this stuff gets everywhere and it's really hard to get rid of, so I've got it on my fingers and it just spreads more and more and more. So I will track this through the house for the remainder of the day and cause all kinds of grief for my wife. Okay, the last one that we're going to use is the black smoke. Let's see. Well, let's open it up. And really, all I do with the black smoke is put it on the gun barrel. And I do this dry. It just gives me a little bit more control. I think that looks good. I might go back here in the tank. Add some black to that area. There we go. So that tank is now ready for a flat coat. And the flat coat's going to not only seal in the decals, but it'll also seal in all this weathering that we just did. For the clear coat, I'm going to be using this Vellejo matte varnish. It's good stuff. I haven't had any problem with it. And again, that's just going to help seal in all this junk. You can still see the shine from the hard coat for those decals. That's going to get rid of all of it and basically give it a consistent overall finish. And like I said, lock in those pastels. Okay, we have the flat coat down. That should keep our dust and dirt and grime all stuck to the tank and not on our fingers, which is nice. We can take a look and you can see we've got some nice variation in the green color, some fading. Now you could go in here with some black and silver and do some chipping if you wanted to, but honestly I don't think it's necessary. And you can see, now what you're not seeing is the decal circles around those decals. So that's the effect you want to go for. You want it to look painted on, like it's painted onto the tank and then it gets dirty. I guess I should smear more dirt on there, but there you go. That is how to paint a Soviet SU-100 medium self-propelled artillery gun. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you do enjoy our Flames of War content, please do check out our Patreon. I'll leave a link down in the video description below. Also check us out on Facebook at All Miniatures Great and Small, and here on YouTube, a like and subscribe would be fantastic. Click that bell so you can receive notification for future uploads. As always, thanks for watching, and keep on wargaming.